In the end of last week's PARSHA, we read about Moshe Rabbeinu's first interaction with Paro, where he presents the argument of the Jewish people for freedom, and Paro reacts in a very extreme manner. He says that the Jews' desire for freedom shows that they're lazy, they're not working hard enough. He imposes a heavier decree. From now on, the straw will be withdrawn and the quota of bricks won't be reduced. And this will hopefully result in the Jews coming to their senses. Moshe Rabbeinu in the end turns to Ribono Shel Olam and he asks, Lama harayos Olam hazeh? Why did you make it worse for the people? Lama zeh shlachtani? Why did you send me? From the time I came to Paro to speak in your name, he did evil to the people. And you didn't save your people. So Moshe Rabbeinu comes to Ribono Shel Olam with a question. Says, why did you make it bad? Why didn't you save Klal Yisrael? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu never seems to answer the question. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, now you'll see that which I will do to Paro. With a strong hand he will send them out. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu never directly addresses the question of Moshe Rabbeinu. That Lama Harayosa. Let me point out, there's a machlekes rishonim as to what exactly Moshe Rabbeinu's question was. Now the Ibn Ezra, the Ramban, all the Mefarshim point out that HaKadosh Baruch Hu really had told Moshe Rabbeinu beforehand that Paro wasn't going to listen. Because Moshe knew that going in. So what was the great surprise? So the Ibn Ezra understands that Moshe Rabbeinu understood that Paro wasn't going to let them go, but he didn't think it was going to get worse. He didn't think that Paro would impose even harsher decrees. So that's the question of Lo Maharayosa. That Paro didn't let the Jews go, that I accept. But Lo Maharayosa, why did you make it worse? I didn't think that my going should make things worse, that the straw would be taken away, and so on and so forth. The Ramban asks the question on the Ibn Ezra, that it seems that wasn't the objection, because Moshe in his question didn't only ask, why did it become worse? He asked, you didn't rescue your people. You didn't take them out of Mitzrayim. It seems that Moshe Rabbeinu was arguing that you should have taken them out, and you didn't. And the question is, how can that be Moshe's grievance? Moshe knew that Paro was going to listen. So the Ramban understands that Moshe's taina was the following. That Moshe said, I knew Paro wouldn't listen until you brought all the Isis and all the knives and all the wonders. But I thought you were going to bring them in a very short period of time. Bam, bam, bam. And then Paro would relent. I didn't think it would be over a long period of time. So that's my question. It says, by my timetable, the Yetzias Mitzrayim should have happened already. So why was it? Why didn't you save your people? I want to point out that according to Ramban's understanding, this question of Loma Hariosa isn't only relevant to the question of the straw. It'll be relevant to the subject of the next two parshias. Because according to Chazal, the SHMOT unfolded over a period of 12 months. So Moshe Rabbeinu's question, why didn't the HaKadosh Baruch Hu put this on an accelerated timetable? Why did it have to be so dragged out and so lengthened? That's an extra burden on the Jews. It's not just a question about this particular gezeira of the straw, but really it's a question about the whole system of the SHMOT, that it was spread over such a long period of time. Why should that be? And again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu never seems to answer the question. There's one other point I'd like to make on the Ramban, that the Ramban says that Moshe Rabbeinu thought that the SHMOT would come one after the other in swift succession. Is there a reason he thought that? Was it simply a mistake? I don't think HaKadosh Baruch Hu misled him. Like, why did Moshe jump to the conclusion that it would be a fast process? Like he assumed as a double pashut that it would be fast, to the point that when it appeared to be stretching out over a long period of time, he comes with a grievance to the Rilon Shloim. Now, what did the Rilon Shloim say that led Moshe Rabbeinu to believe that it was going to be accelerated? Why did Moshe think it would be a swift process and not a drawn-out process? Put that in the back burner for a moment. I just want to point out that in the end of last week's parsha, the beginning of this week's parsha, again, there's no explicit answer to Moshe Rabbeinu's objection, to the Lo Mahariyosa. In Rashi, we find that HaKadosh Baruch Hu rebukes Moshe Rabbeinu. First he says, Ata Tireh. He says, now you'll see. Now you'll see. And Rashi says, this was HaKadosh Baruch Hu informing Moshe of a punishment. He says, because you were impatient, and you weren't like Avram and the others who were not Maharher, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Ata Tireh. Now you'll see, but you're not going to be Zoichet to see the defeat of the kings of Canaan. You're going to die in the Midbar. So this, by the way, is a very intriguing Rashi. The Rashi seems to say that the punishment of Moshe Rabbeinu not to go into Eretz Yisrael is somehow related to this question of Lo Mahariyosa. Of course, we always associate it with the chet of the name Riva. That's a subject for another time. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is rebuking Moshe Rabbeinu. And likewise, at the beginning of next week's parsha, or this week's parsha, it says, Vayidaber Elokim el Moshe. It says, Elokim, Hashem spoke to Moshe, but Elokim is the Midas Hadin. Rashi says, Diber Ito Mishpat. HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to him strongly, Al Shehikshel L'daber, because he spoke against HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a very hard way. And he said, Lam Hariyosa L'am Hazeh. Again, Rashi understands that the whole parsha is filled with rebuke of Moshe Rabbeinu. But there's no explicit answer. No explicit answer. So I would like to suggest that really the first section of our parsha, which, as we'll point out, is a perplexing section, really, if we read between the lines, is really addressing this question of Lo Mahariyosa. Either according to the Ibn Ezra's interpretation or the Ramban's interpretation, it's giving the explanation of why it had to be this way. We pointed out last year in the Shiur of PARSHA SHMOS of Tashanayin days, so it's a year and a week, we pointed out that the beginning of our parsha, Parshas Vayera, is very perplexing. Because we know that Moshe Rabbeinu in last week's parsha stood at the sneh, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him his instructions, his mission, his charge, to go and take the Jews out of Mitzrayim. Moshe goes to Paro the first time, is unsuccessful. HaKadosh Baruch Hu now is sending him to go a second time. There's no need for a long explanation of the mission. All we need is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu shall Moshe go try again. And our parsha begins with a long explanation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I appeared to the Avos, I established a covenant, I've heard their cries, and therefore go and tell them, V'ot seisi, I'll take them out, V'yitzalti, I'll save them, V'go'alti, I'll redeem them, V'lokachti. With this long preamble, this long mission statement, seems to be unnecessary. Because whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu said at the sneh is equally applicable here. Because why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu have to give Moshe a new charge, a new mission, to send him to Paro for the second time? L'chora, what he did the first time is what he's meant to do the second time. We pointed out that in fact it is not really the same mission. If you compare what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu at the sneh to what HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu now, there are some very fundamental differences. And we talked about many differences that year, and we obviously can't repeat everything we said then, but I'd like to point out two major differences. Number one, in Parsha Shemot at the sneh, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu explains to Moshe Rabbeinu why he wishes to take the Jews out of Mitzrayim, he mentions, I've seen their suffering, I've heard their cries, and so on and so forth. But there is no mention of the bris. There is no mention of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had made a covenant with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to bring their descendants to Eretz Yisrael. The bris is not mentioned at all. And accordingly, Eretz Yisrael in PARSHA SHMOT at the Sneh is not described as the land that was promised to the Avos, because again, there's no mention of the bris. It's simply described as Eretz Tova Urachava, a good land, a broad land, and Eretz Zavas Chalav Udvash, a land which is flowing with milk and honey. It's a very, very nice place. But there's no historical connection to Eretz Yisrael. In our Parsha, everything revolves around the bris. Hashem says, I appeared to Avram, to Yitzchak and Yaakov, Bekel Shakoi, V'gam Hakimosius Risi Itam, I establish a covenant to give them Eretz Yisrael. Lochein, and therefore, tell them, V'yitzesi, V'yitzalti, V'galti, V'lakachti, therefore tell them that I will take them out. Because here the emphasis is on the bris. And there's no mention of Eretz Yisrael as Zavas Chalav Udvash. Eretz Yisrael is the promised land. This is the land which is the subject of the covenant. The question is, what is the idea of the change? What really changes here? Well, we explain that Moshe Rabbeinu was really an outsider. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was raised in the palace of Paro. His identification with the suffering of the Jewish people was limited. Now, I'll discuss a section that we did not talk about last year. The first time that Moshe Rabbeinu goes out, he says he wants to go out and see his brothers. He wants to see their sufferings. And he sees a Mitzri beating a Jew. So he kills the Mitzri. Kills the Mitzri. Very, very courageous act. The next day, he goes out and he sees two Jews fighting. And he says to one, V'yomer l'Rosh, he said to the Rosh, Lama Sakarayach, why are you beating your friend? So the Jew answers back, and he says, first of all, Misomcha, who made you a judge over us? Halahargeni ata omer, are you going to kill me just like you killed the Mitzri? So Moshe Rabbeinu said, Acheino da hadavar. I see that it's known. It's known. And I have to escape, and accordingly he ran away. That's the Pshuto Shel Mikra. But Rashi says, on the words Acheino da hadavar, he brings a medrash, that Moshe Rabbeinu said, now I know the answer to what I was wondering about. I was wondering that of all the nations of the world, why was the Jewish people deserving of such suffering? And now I know the answer. If a Jew can say a thing like that to me, so I know they deserve whatever is coming to them. And that's it. It seems from that point on, Moshe Rabbeinu has no interest in the Jewish people until HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to him at the Sneh, which is a very, very long time. Decades. Moshe has no interest in his Jewish brethren anymore until HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to him. What's the idea? It seems from the simple pshat in the pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu's killing of the Mitzri is not so much because he identifies with the suffering of the Jewish victim, but rather Moshe Rabbeinu loved justice. He saw an injustice taking place. An innocent person was being beaten, and his sense of indignation brought about that he should kill the Mitzri. When he discovered that the Jews were not innocent people, that maybe they had faults for which they were deserving of this torment, so that was it. Moshe Rabbeinu was no longer concerned. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was not part of the Jewish population. He didn't live among them. He didn't share their experiences. But he was a good person, a just person, a moral person. So he couldn't be civil. He couldn't bear an injustice, an avil. But when it began to make sense, when things fell into place, and now he understands exactly why the Jews are enslaved, that's the end of his concern. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes and tells him that in the meantime, over these several decades, it's gotten worse. That's what the pasuk says. The pasuk says in the end of Parak Beis, in last week's parsha, it says, "Vayihi bayomim harabim mohem." It was over those many days that Moshe Rabbeinu was in exile. So Vayomos Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Mitzrayim died. Chazal say he really didn't die. He became a leper. He began to bathe in Jewish blood. They began to groan from the work of Vayizaku, and so on and so forth. In other words, it got worse. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, I want you to go and take out the Jews. But for Moshe Rabbeinu, again, the call was not because Moshe identified with the suffering of his Jewish brothers. It was because HaKadosh Baruch Hu pointed out that the injustice is continuing, and therefore Moshe Rabbeinu is selected to go and to rectify the injustice. It has nothing to do with the covenant. It has nothing to do with the bris. It's the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu points out to Moshe Rabbeinu, I've seen the suffering, I've heard the cries, they are innocent people, they don't deserve to be in this foreign land, so let's take them out and bring them to a rich Eretz Zavas Chalub Udvash. In fact, the one time that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tries to hint to Moshe Rabbeinu the possibility of a historical association, Moshe Rabbeinu rejects it. Because Moshe asks the question, V'omru li ma SHMOT. They're going to ask me, what is Hashem's name? What should I say? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, tell them, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be that which I will be. So what does that mean? So Rashi quotes the Chazal, that Hashem was saying that I will be with them in this tzara, and I'll be with them in future tzaras. I'll be with them for eternity. So Moshe says, Ribono shel olam, daya l'tzara b'shaita. It's enough to worry about the later tzaras then. Because right now our concern is with the here and now. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, good point. Tell them, Ehyeh shlochani aleichem. Not Ehyeh asher ehyeh, not I will be and I will be, but just I will be. I'll be with them in this tzara. So we pointed out last year, what's the question? Like, HaKadosh Baruch Hu pointed out that this is relevant to the future, and Moshe Rabbeinu said, no, don't mention the future, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, yeah, you're right, I'm not going to mention the future. And what's going on? So we said like this, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling Moshe Rabbeinu that it's true, that to you, the idea of a covenant and a historical association won't resonate. But when the Bnei Yisrael ask, what is my name? To them you can explain, right, that I am the God with whom there is a historical association and a covenant which is eternal, and so on and so forth. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, no. Daya l'tzara b'shaita. Now, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was right. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to work with what he had to work with. He had to work with Moshe Rabbeinu. If Moshe Rabbeinu can't appreciate the idea of a bris, the idea of an eternal covenant, so okay, that's how it has to be. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, listen, if this is how you understand it, then so it will be. Ehyeh shlochani aleichem. We're not going to talk about a historical plan or a covenant in the future. We're going to talk about the here and now. There's an injustice being perpetrated. Okay, I'm sending you to rectify this injustice. And at this point, that's how Moshe Rabbeinu understands it. I want to point out that I believe this is really the insight into a very perplexing story that takes place in last week's parsha. When Moshe Rabbeinu on the way, he's traveling to Mitzrayim to do God's shlichus, and a malach comes and wants to kill Moshe Rabbeinu. So, what's the problem? Because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't circumcise his second child, Eliezer. So, a malach came to kill him. So, Sipporah takes a stone, circumcises the child, saves Moshe Rabbeinu's life. That's the story. So the question we all wonder is, like, what's going on over here? HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends Moshe Rabbeinu on this mission. The fate of the entire Klal Yisrael is dependent on the success of this mission And HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to kill Moshe, send the Malach to kill Moshe Rabbeinu on the way. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So, when people ask me what the meaning of this parsha is, so I point out, you see from here, that even a person who's doing great things for the nation has to make sure that his personal obligations are also satisfied. That yes, that despite the fact that Moshe was on a shlichus to save the entire Jewish people, but if he would have been derelict in his responsibility, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have killed him too. Okay, doesn't seem satisfying though. Is that really the case? That makes sense. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sending him to save Klal Yisrael, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to, on the spot, do with Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, the answer is this: that it really is a consequence of the way with which Moshe Rabbeinu went to do the mission. Since Moshe Rabbeinu didn't go as part of the covenant, as part of the bris, he went because there's an injustice, and injustice has to be rectified. You can't rectify an injustice with an injustice. If Moshe Rabbeinu was forfeited his own right to live for having neglected this mitzvah, you're not going to spare Moshe Rabbeinu to correct an injustice. That would be trying to rectify a wrong with a right, or with a wrong, I should say. In other words, if Moshe Rabbeinu was guilty, you're not going to make him the shliach to rectify an injustice. You'll carry out justice and take Moshe Rabbeinu away. In other words, if Moshe Rabbeinu would have gone with a sense of the covenant, it's not that I'm going to correct an injustice. I'm a shliach of the Ribono Shel Olam because of his love for Klal Yisrael. So I'll call p'shoyim t'chas ha'ava. Love can overcome offenses too. So the offense of Moshe Rabbeinu neglecting the bris milah perhaps could have been overlooked by HaKadosh Baruch Hu because of his love for Klal Yisrael. But if you're not going to be God's shliach because of his love for Klal Yisrael, because of the covenant, you're going to rectify an injustice, then you have to be consistent with the midas hadin. Because if you do something for which you're deserving of death, there's not going to be any psharas, no compromises. You're not going to be spared just because you're doing something important. If the thing that you're doing which is so important is you're doing justice, it has to be just. There can't be any compromises on your personal account because you're settling a account which affects greater numbers. I think that's a ha'ara in pshat in that parsha. And of course, that first shlichus was unsuccessful. And why it was unsuccessful was the subject of last year's year. It was exactly what Paro understood and misunderstood and the reaction, and that we won't deal with tonight. But it was unsuccessful. And unsuccessful to the extent that Moshe Rabbeinu has a taina of Lam Harayos. Why'd you make it worse? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, now listen to me. He says, the reason you have all these questions is because you did not understand what the essence of what the shlichus was. Because you thought that you were being sent to rectify an injustice. On that basis, you are totally correct in believing, number one, it should not have gotten worse, because if it was unjust for Paro to enslave the Bnei Yisrael, it's doubly unjust to withdraw the straw. And certainly, it should not be delayed, because if it's an injustice, then it should be rectified as swiftly as possible. In other words, if you understand that your shlichus was to rectify an injustice, then your objections are totally valid. Right? It should have been immediate, and it certainly should not have gotten worse before it got better. It says, but it's a total misunderstanding of what my intention was. And it's one of these things that Chazal say, there are certain divrei Torah, ein adam oimed aleim ela im kein nichshal b'hem. You can't understand them until you've stumbled. First you have to make a mistake, and then you can get it right. So first, you went your way. You went your way. Your way didn't work, says, now we'll do it my way, the Baruch says. And let me explain exactly what this is. This is not a question of rectifying an injustice. This is a question of bris. And let me explain the difference. First of all, why it is not to rectify an injustice and why it is for a bris. You know, there's a very serious question, the question of theodicy. How do we justify evil in the world in light of the fact that we have a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly virtuous? Why should there be seemingly undeserved evil? Now, this is a very, very broad question. But let's talk about one specific type of evil, the evil that people choose to do to others. Should God stop that? We're not talking about evils that God seems to cause, natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, etc. That's something else. That's a question that we'll not deal with tonight. But the evils that people do to other people. Because if God is all we think He is, should He intervene? Should He stop that from happening? Should He prevent a Hitler? Should He prevent a Paro from doing their evil deeds? And on this question, there's a range of opinions. Some say yes. Some say that despite the fact that as a rule, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives people free will, but He should not give free will to hurt other people. That's not right. That's not fair. And therefore, those who take that position would say that if you see A doing an evil to B, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu not intervening, you have to have some cheshbon why it is coming to be, why he deserves it. Because if it really is undeserved, then the Rebbeinu Shalom should intervene and stop A from doing it. That's one school of thought. There's another school of thought, which I believe is correct, which is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's gift of free will is an absolute gift. And it even is extended to cause harm to other people. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives people free will and the ability to perpetrate evils that will impact others. And this idea is quoted from the Darchei in PARSHA Vayeshev, that a Baal Bechira can inflict evils that otherwise the person wouldn't experience. This is why the Darchei says, on Peter Zohar actually, that Yosef was safe in the pit that was filled with snakes and scorpions, but had he been in his brother's clutches, they could have killed him. And therefore Reuven, by suggesting that he be thrown in the pit, did save Yosef's life. Because had the brothers kept their hands on him, they could have killed him in the pit. Snakes and scorpions, he was safe. A Baal Bechira can exercise his free will to impact and hurt a person even beyond that which he otherwise would be deserving. And therefore, if you see Paro enslaving the Jewish people, it might be an injustice. But there is no expectation that Rebbeinu Shalom should necessarily intervene. Moshe Rabbeinu originally held, yes, Moshe Rabbeinu held, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu was coming and saying that I'm going to take the Jews out of Mitzrayim, Moshe would have jumped to the conclusion, oh, it must be because it's an injustice. The Jews don't deserve it. And this is the way it's meant to be. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, being omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly virtuous, would intervene to prevent an injustice from being done. That undoubtedly is the intention of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That's my shlichus. That's why I'm being sent. And therefore, undoubtedly, it'll be immediate. And it's certainly not going to get any worse before it gets better. Because if I'm being sent to rectify an injustice, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu already has reached the point that He's determined that it's an injustice, how can it get worse? Right? It should be dealt with and solved as swiftly as possible. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu certainly thought. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu said it's a mistake. That's not how the world works. If not for the element of bris, there would be no reason, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, that I should intervene in the fact that one nation is enslaving another nation. And throughout history, you see this again and again and again. Slavery, it's not that The enslavement of the Jewish people was a one-time event in history? In the ancient world, one nation subjugating another nation as slaves repeats itself time and time and time and time again, and nothing happens. There's never a divine intervention. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians subjugated other nations. The Romans had slaves. The Americans in the South had slaves. There never was the Yeshiva Mitzrayim. There never was a divine intervention. Well, does that mean that in all other instances it was just? No, it was unjust. But that's the fact of life. The fact of life is man has free will, and he can use his free will to hurt other people, to enslave them, to subjugate them. And that's the system which HaKadosh Baruch Hu set up the world with. It's inscrutable, we can't understand it, but that's the system. And there's no expectation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should intervene. So to think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu intervened over here in Mitzrayim simply because there was an intolerable injustice is not true. If that was the case, this should have been replicated dozens of times over the course of human history. Again and again and again and again and again. Every time one nation enslaves another nation, we should have SHMOT and Gula. And yet we never have it. This is a unique event in the history of mankind. You see it from the time of the Jews. So obviously, it is not because, since there's an injustice, it's an intolerable injustice, HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves justice, he's going to step in and intervene. That's not the case. That's not the pshat. That's not what's going on over here. There's a totally different over here. There's a bris, there's a covenant. There is a special love that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for the Jewish people. A special historical relationship with the Jewish people. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has plans for them. And that plans aren't going to be realized as slaves in Mitzrayim, they're going to be realized as free people in Eretz Yisrael. And that is the purpose of the Gula. But let's explore this covenant. This covenant is a very mysterious covenant because there's something in that parsha of the covenant which also is mystifying. Go back to Parshas Lech Lecha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to Avram, and he tells him that I'm going to give you Eretz Yisrael. So Avram asks the question to Yonash Loilam. It says in the pasuk again. The Yomer Elav Hashem says to him, "Ani Hashem." Hashem would say, "Sichim Yorkavdim." I took out of Yorkavdim. Lo seis Lacha Es Haaretz Azos L'Rish. I give you this land. So Avram says, "Vayomar Hashem Elokim B'mo Eida Ki Roshet." How do I know I'll inherit it? How do I know? How do I know? So the Ramban explains that what was the question? The question was that a promise, as a rule, is conditional on conditions, on being deserving. So maybe my children, my descendants, will not be deserving of the gift of Eretz Yisrael, and it won't happen. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes a bris. HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes a bris. So in those days when they made a bris, what was the symbolic ritual of a bris? They took animals, they cut the animals in two, and they walked between the halves. And that was the symbolic krisas bris. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avraham Avinu to take the number of animals, to cut them down the middle, and so on and so forth, and there's a bris. So that's the answer to the question. You're wondering, how do you know? I'm telling you, it's a covenant. That means it'll happen whether your descendants are deserving or not. It's a covenant, non-conditional promise. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avram something perplexing. He says, "V'yomer l'Avram." Hashem tells Avram, "Yodo Ateda, you should know. Ki ger yizarucha be'eretz lo lahem. Your children will be strangers in a strange land. Va'avodu v'inu loisam, they'll be tortured 400 years. V'gam esugay asher yavodu donanaychi, I will punish that nation. V'achar keitzim b'chushgot, and the Jews will go out with great wealth." So what is the point over here? So the Ramban says something very perplexing. He says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling Avram like this: even though I'm making a bris, but please be advised that that doesn't mean it's going to happen immediately. Just FYI, for your information, it's going to be a long time until it's fulfilled, 400 years. But in other words, this idea that there'll be a Golus Mitzrayim, there'll be an enslavement, there'll be torture, really has nothing to do with the question that Avram was asking. Avram was asking, how do I know? Maybe my descendants' sins will result in their not getting it. So to that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'll make a bris. We'll have a covenant, cut the animals, we'll have a ritual, a ceremony, there's an unconditional promise, don't worry, you'll get it no matter what. And this is just, according to the Ramban, an added tidbit of information. And if you're wondering when it'll be, I'm just letting you know. It's not going to be immediately, it'll be in 400 years. There is a line from the Ramchal. The Ramchal wrote a mimer called Mimer HaChachma. And the Mimer HaChachma, one section of it talks about the Seder. The mitzvahs of the Seder, Yetzias Mitzrayim, the rituals of the Seder. And in the first paragraph of the Mimer HaChachma, the Ramchal writes something, just a few words, maybe 10 words, which I believe open up the entire PARSHA. He writes the following. He writes that after the Jews suffered in Mitzrayim all that they suffered, the Midas Hadin was Mefuyesas, the Midas Hadin was appeased, and thereby the Jews merited all that they ultimately merited. He writes, after the Jews suffered all they suffered in Mitzrayim, the Midas Hadin was Mufuyesas, was appeased, and the Jews therefore merited all that they merited. Biur Devarav, what the Ramchal is saying is like this. Now, these are mystical concepts, so to really understand them is perhaps beyond our grasp. But we know there's a Midas Hadin. There's an attribute, an aspect of justice in the world. And justice has certain demands. One of the demands of justice is that people should not get things they don't deserve. A person has good health and parnasa. If he doesn't deserve it, the Midas Hadin is makatreg. The Midas Hadin objects. So why should this person have parnasa and have good health? The person is a balaveira. The Midas Hadin is makatreg. The Midas Hadin has to be appeased. It has to be mufuyesas. It has to be appeased. Various ways that the Midas Hadin can be appeased. One of the ways, understands the Ramchal, is great suffering. That's how the Midas Hadin is paid off. Now, we don't believe that through suffering you become more deserving. You become deserving by good deeds. You learn Torah, you do mitzvahs, you become more deserving. Passive suffering doesn't make you more deserving. But it is mefayes the Midas Hadin. The Midas Hadin removes its objection. Okay, the person suffered, the Midas Hadin is satisfied. Why this works, how this works, this is something which is beyond our understanding. But somehow, the kitrug, the accusation of the Midas Hadin, is satisfied through suffering. So a person who otherwise would be undeserving can be given things for reasons that God Himself knows through suffering. I believe that's the ultimate answer to the question of why HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avram, Yodoa Teida. Avram's question was like this. He says, you're making a promise. You're giving a gift to my descendants of Eretz Yisrael. This is part of a covenant, part of an arrangement. We will be your nation. We will serve you. We will establish a state based on values of Torah. It's a very, very wonderful thing. But what if we don't deserve it? What if we do Averis? And the Midas Hadin will be makatreg. The Midas will object and say, look, it's a very nice plan. It's a very nice idea, a Jewish state, and Jewish people, and Torah values, but they don't deserve to have Eretz Yisrael and deserve to have this wonderful gift. So what's the answer? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu will make a bris. But how does a bris work? What does it mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes an unconditional promise? But what will satisfy the Midas Hadin? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu answers, Yodoa Teida, you should know that the satisfaction of the Midas Hadin, the teretz to the kitrug of the Midas Hadin, is that there'll be a tremendous suffering that will precede the Yetzias Mitzrayim, precede the entry to Eretz Yisrael. 400 years of being strangers, of enslavement, of torture. And with that, the Midas Hadin will be Mefuyeses. The Midas Hadin will be satisfied. And then you can be Zoyechet to the gift of Eretz Yisrael forever. And the Midas Hadin will never be Makatreg. The Midas Hadin will never offer a grievance that they don't deserve it, because they paid for it. They paid for it with their suffering beforehand. And that's what's going on in the Parsha by Avraham Avinu. It's not just like the Ramban says, FYI, for your information, I'm telling you that even though there's a bris, it's not going to be right away, it's going to be later. It's much deeper than that. Because the Baruch was explaining what the basis of the bris is. What is how can there be an unconditional promise? Why isn't there a kitrug of the Midas Hadin? That how can the Jews be given the gift of Eretz Yisrael unconditionally? Perhaps they'll be undeserving, perhaps they'll have done Averis. The answer is, Yadoa Teda, you should know that there's a process. There's going to be suffering, 400 years, Geirus, Abdus, Inui, torture. And after all that, the Midas Hadin will be Mufuyasas, and then they can be given Eretz Yisrael unconditionally. So the Yadoa Teda is essential. Come to our Parsha, that's exactly what's going on. Because Moshe Rabbeinu understood Lechatchila, he thought he was being sent to rectify an injustice. That's what he thought. Just like in Mitzrayim, he killed the Mitzri because he saw an injustice being done. The Jews are suffering unfairly, you're being sent. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu thought, of course, it's not going to get worse. And it's going to be immediate, because if it's an injustice, and God has determined it's an injustice, then it certainly shouldn't get worse, and it certainly should be rectified as soon as possible. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends him, and Moshe Rabbeinu discovers to his dismay that's not the case. It doesn't happen right away, and it even gets worse. So he doesn't understand what's going on. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, now let me explain to you. This has nothing to do with rectifying an injustice. It says, I don't rectify these injustices. Man is given the gift of free will. He can use that to enslave people, and that's why the Yetzias Mitzrayim is unique in the history of man. It is not simply the rectification of an injustice. If that was the case, then every episode of slavery should have been ended with a divine intervention. This is something which is totally different. It's a bris. It's a covenant. It's a plan. I made with the Avos, with Avraham Avinu, the bris bein absarim. And for that plan to be realized, there is a necessity of suffering, because there can't be an unconditional promise unless the Midas Hadin is mufuyesas, unless the Midas Hadin is satisfied. And that's why it has to get worse, and that's why it's a drawn-out process, and that's why the suffering is extended. This is all part of the process of Geula. It's the process of Geula in the sense of Geula being a function of bris. And therefore, everything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe at the beginning of this Parsha directly addresses the question of Lama Harayos. Why did you make it worse? This Moshe is saying it's a totally different scheme of Geula. It's not rectifying an injustice. Right? It is the actualization of a covenant that was made with the Avos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a plan that, again, from our perspective is inscrutable. Why should HaKadosh Baruch Hu select us despite our being undeserving? Apparently HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees something in us that we don't appreciate ourselves. But this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's choice. He selected us. But the midas didn't have to be paid. So that's the suffering. That's the Yadoa Teda. That's the suffering. And therefore, if it has to get worse before it gets better, and it has to be a drawn-out process, so be it. That's what it has to be. But this is the answer to Moshe Rabbeinu's question. And that is the new shlichus. This is the preamble of Parshas Va'era. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling Moshe Rabbeinu a totally new scheme of redemption, contrary to what Moshe Rabbeinu assumed earlier. And I would conjecture to say that Moshe Rabbeinu could not have appreciated it until this point. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu did not identify with the suffering of the Jewish people until he was the cause of their suffering. In other words, when he brought about the Gzeira of power of the straw, and he was the cause of their increased suffering, only then did he begin to identify with their suffering to the sense that he could understand that it's not just a question of rectifying an injustice. It's something which is very, very personal. And that is the buying into the scheme of the covenant, which of course is the theme of our Parsha. And of course, because of that, that is why the process has to be the way it is. The suffering is necessary, the intensification of the suffering is necessary. It's necessary that it be dragged out another Yud Beis Chodesh, another 12 months. In other words, these are not setbacks. These are necessary elements to achieving the potential of an eternal bris. It's the Adoa Teda, it's the Golus, the suffering, the Inui, is necessary to Mephias, to Midas Adin, right, so that the promise, the bris, can be an unconditional one that will be fulfilled in any case. I'll call upon it.